Thank you so much for joining us for this really important panel discussion on the subject of power in numbers, the national movement to end conviction record discrimination in housing. Really appreciate it. My name is Andre Ward. I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society, and also a member of the Fair Chance for Housing Coalition, as the Fortune Society supports and works with the coalition to ensure that we get Fair Chance for Housing Act legislation passed. And we're excited for this important conversation, one that's going to be informative, but two, inspiring to get those of you who have joined us motivated and in action with pushing the legislation that we need to get passed, that's Fair Chance for Housing legislation, passed. And we certainly look forward to hearing from you. Today, we have some really powerful panelists that are joining us from throughout the state and throughout the country, who are experts in the area of dealing with housing discrimination and the role that giving people access to housing can have and what that means. And we will have this important discussion, and you'll continue to listen to us and join us. And I want to just give some context, however, as we begin to establish how things have come to where it is and what do we need to begin to start doing. So the historical context relative to this subject matter is really, really important. And so since 1970, one of the things that we noticed is that the incarceration population in the United States has increased by about 492%. And as it happens, there are almost 2 million people incarcerated in the United States territories in different forms, whether it be prisons, jails, and detention facilities. And the result of that is that the United States, we know, incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. And this disparate impact of this mass incarceration in the United States falls almost exclusively on people of color. When we think about that, we think about people of color, we talk about while Black men comprise about 13% of the United States male population, they in fact also account for nearly 35% of the incarcerated male population with more than 1 year sentence, which is really interesting to note. And so the lack of access to safe, affordable housing is the most immediate problem that we know of that people face when they return home from prison or jail. And individuals with criminal justice involvement can face an extremely harsh environment when seeking housing. And in addition to the high cost of housing and lower earnings experienced by many formerly incarcerated people, one of the things that we note is that discrimination based on race, criminal justice involvement, and housing vouchers, despite the obvious need for housing, right, we realize that 5 million formerly incarcerated people living in the United States are almost 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public. And so discriminatory practices based on criminal records contribute to the growth of the prison to shelter pipeline, the growing rates of formerly incarcerated people living in homeless shelters or on the streets because they cannot secure housing. And the disparate impact of mass incarceration on Black and Latinx individuals impedes people from safe and affordable housing based solely on a conviction history or a criminal conviction. Thus, housing discrimination based on criminal justice involvement further perpetuates the types of discrimination the Fair Housing Act was meant to counteract. And so safe and affordable housing is an essential component of successful reentry from incarceration. And studies have shown that obtaining permanent housing means that formerly incarcerated people or individuals are more likely to gain employment, maintain sobriety, complete parole supervision, and achieve the necessary stability to stay safely in the community. Housing has been called the linchpin that holds the reintegration process together, and I quote, and with greater access to housing for all, there are fewer crimes and thus increased community safety. And so for all of those reasons, we're seeing a national movement to address the problem of housing discrimination against people with conviction records. Several cities and counties across the country and one state have passed fair chance for housing laws. And surveys have found that 90% of landlords perform background checks. A survey of a formerly incarcerated individuals and their families across 13 states found that 79% reported being denied housing due to a conviction. Fair chance housing laws are trying to address this problem by limiting the use of background checks. And so one of the things that we've known is that we have 4 panelists, as we talked about a little bit earlier, And these panelists are from across the U.S. who are part of the fight to end housing discrimination against people with conviction records. Some fought successfully to pass fair chance for housing legislation and to get that law passed. But before I introduce my panelists, I just want to share some housekeeping stuff so folk are knowing how to really engage this space. And if folks have any questions for the panelists as we move along, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. So I'll repeat that. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And we will leave time to answer a couple of questions toward the end. And with that being said, let's go right into introducing our panelists. And so John Jones III, and welcome, John. Thanks so much for joining us. John Jones III is a father of three and a third-generation East Oakland resident. As a former incarcerated advocate, John seeks to transform his community by utilizing his experiences and expertise as a consultant, life coach, and subject matter expert. And after being unsheltered and unemployed for 18 months, John became involved in community organizing and advocacy to empower himself and others by sharing his personal story of pain, trauma, faith, and transformation to inspire young people, as well as fight for policy change. And John has worked on the local, regional, and state level on ballot measures and much needed programs and services. And he's currently the director of Violence Interruption and Prevention Program at BOSS. And John is a boss. John, Building Opportunities for Self-Sufficiency. John, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here. Good morning / afternoon, everyone.
Thanks so much for being here. And we also have joining us Bruce Reilly, who is the deputy director of both VOTE and Voters Organized to Educate. He's a writer and founding member of the formerly incarcerated Convicted People and Families movement. And Bruce provides expert analyses on discrimination in employment, housing, and voting rights. Originally born in foster care, he found his identity as a young jailhouse lawyer for his 12 years in prison before his parole. Bruce put his knowledge to work by joining Direct Action for Rights and Equality in 2005 and played a vital role in passing significant criminal justice reforms such as the restoration of voting rights, eliminating mandatory minimums statewide, ban the box, the Good Samaritan Overdose Prevention Act, unshackling incarcerated pregnant women, and probation violation reform. So thanks so much, or rather reform. Thanks so much, Bruce, for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic.
Totally. And we'll turn now to Merf Ehman. And Merf is the executive director of Columbia Legal Services, which supports community-led justice movements that transform racialized systems and eradicates racism. Organizationally, Merf and Columbia Legal Services are focused on creating an adaptive organization that prioritizes anti-racist efforts internally and externally, and learning how to use their legal skills to support and build collective power around initiatives identified by the communities most impacted. And lastly, we have Marie-Claire Tran-Leung. And so Marie-Claire is the Evictions Initiative Project Director and Senior Staff Attorney at the National Housing Law Project. Her work focuses on federal, state, and local advocacy to help keep individuals and families in their homes by stopping evictions and reforming landlord-tenant laws. As a national expert on housing barriers for people with arrest and conviction records, she has also testified before Congress and authorized a similar report, When Discrimination Means Denial, a national perspective on criminal records and federally subsidized housing. Before joining NHLP in 2022, Marie-Claire led a multi-state advocacy network focused on the intersection of housing and the criminal legal system at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, served on the steering committee of the coalition that pushed for the Just Housing Amendment to the Cook County Housing Rights Ordinance in Illinois, advised numerous advocates and campaigns pushing for fair chance housing laws, and received a Soros Justice Fellowship to focus on reducing housing barriers for justice-involved individuals. Merf, how are you doing? And thanks so much for joining us. How are you feeling?
I'm great. Glad to be here.
Totally. And Marie-Claire, how are you feeling? Thanks so much for joining us today.
Very good. Happy to be here with everyone.
Totally. So, folks, we're going to jump right into it because we have a great amount of people who have joined us for this really important conversation. And you as experts, we're looking to inform this discussion and also to inspire people to move away motivated to be involved in actions to address this issue. And so I'll start with you, Marie-Claire. You know, fair chance housing laws, come in all shapes and sizes, as we know. And can you give us a brief overview of the types of laws that exist already?
Sure. So fair chance housing laws on the whole really regulate three main areas. The first area is whether and when a landlord can ask about a person's arrest or conviction history. The second area is whether and how landlords can take an adverse action based on that history. So a lot of times we think of adverse action in the application phase, but it also applies to evictions and other parts of the rental housing process. If the law permits landlords to use criminal history in certain circumstances, then the third area is the type of process that landlords must follow to give applicants a fair chance. So that's the general contours of the different fair chance housing laws that are across the country. And as Andre mentioned, they come in lots of shapes and sizes. And we could spend a lot of time going through the differences, but I think the major differences flow from that second area, which is whether and how landlords take adverse action based on arrest and conviction history. And I would characterize a lot of these, I would put a lot of these ordinances in two buckets. So laws in the first bucket prohibit landlords from using criminal history altogether. And the primary example of those are the ordinances in Seattle and in Berkeley. And we're very lucky to have two of the main advocates that push for those ordinances in those jurisdictions. So they'll be able to talk more about that. Laws in the second bucket prohibit landlords from using some, but not all types of criminal history. And what these laws tend to create exceptions. So, for example, some exceptions are based on how old a record is. In Cook County, where I did work with the Just Housing Coalition, landlords there can consider conviction records that were entered within the last 3 years, but they can't consider convictions that are older than 3 years. These laws can also create exceptions based on the type of record. So, for example, whether the criminal activity was a felony or a misdemeanor. And some laws create a combination of these two. They look at how old the record is and they look at the type of conviction, and sometimes they make a matrix on what landlords can and cannot use in terms of criminal history. So for these laws that allow landlords to use some type of criminal history, the landlord usually has to follow some sort of procedures that are designed to protect the tenants. And the most common procedure is the individualized assessment, which is a process where the landlord hears from the tenant and weighs evidence to determine whether the criminal history is relevant to whether the person can carry out their responsibilities as a tenant, or whether the information is even accurate in the first place. And other procedural protections include whether the landlord has to give the tenant certain documents, like a copy of the criminal background check or a denial letter listing the reasons. And these procedural protections are really important for the second type of fair chance laws, because it really helps tenants to enforce their rights.
And thank you so much, Marie-Claire, for that summary. I mean, it's critically important, right, for people to have that understanding. So thank you for that. And, I want to ground us now in moving forward. I want to ground us now in why we're all in this fight to begin with. And this is obviously going to be directing this question to Bruce, John, and Merf, right? And we'll start off with John, right? And what is it like for people coming home, right, as they try to find housing, right, both immediately after release and in the years later? And we'll start with you, John, followed by Merf, and then Bruce.
Oh, thanks. I will start off by saying something that one of my dear colleagues always share. For many of us, the punishment as it relates to being incarcerated truly doesn't begin until after we're released. right? We say things like coming home. What does that really mean? For some of us, we didn't have a home to come to because we had this additional barrier of a record, right? And I think it's very important for folks to understand just a few key things. First of all, myself, I always share as someone formerly incarcerated, I have both a civic duty and a moral obligation to give back to my community. What does that mean? At a time where we're talking about public safety, it's important to ensure that everyone have the things that they need in order to feel safe. Safe and stable housing is a key cornerstone to reduce recidivism. If I don't have a safe place to live, it's going to reduce my ability to seek employment. It's going to reduce my ability to seek higher education. And I'll end on this note, as someone that's a single father, the shame I felt not being able to provide stable housing for my children. I want us to always remember when we talk about the formerly incarcerated population, we're talking about human beings. And we are human beings that have children. We're human beings who have siblings. We're human beings who have parents. And on this note, I'll end because my colleague, I see Anita Wills is here. Think about this, y'all, on this note. We're talking about what's it like coming home. Imagine a mother can house her child in her womb for 9 months. A mother is unable to house said child if they are caught up with a criminal record. Let's just think about that for a moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, John, too. And we'll turn to Merf now, right? Again, Merf, what is it like for people coming home, right, as they try to find housing both immediately after release and years later?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly challenging because of all the barriers, the cultural issues, the lack of support. And I just want to say that take a step ahead of that. I'm not a person who was incarcerated, but that doesn't mean that I didn't commit crimes. And so we have a different system, and it really is a race-based system. So I was put into the mental health system, and I was locked up, but in a mental health system. And so I don't have a criminal record, even though I committed assault and drug possession and various other crimes. And so my reentry was really smooth. I was put into a halfway house, and then I was able to get permanent housing and be a renter for the next 25 years, go back to school, do all those things that we want people to do when they reenter. And then we add, just because someone is incarcerated, we add all of these barriers. No one ever asked me, have you ever committed a crime? They only ask me, have you ever been arrested or convicted? And so I always get to say no. And so I think we really need to think about that.
Absolutely. And Bruce, obviously, right, you've been doing this work for some time now too, and understand the immediate impacts, the collateral consequences and impacts of incarceration. And so talk to us a little bit about that. Bruce, like, what is it like for people coming home to try to find housing immediately and even after release, years later?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the challenge and discrimination begins even before release. I got into this work while I was helping people on the inside in various legal regards, including helping people kind of formulate their parole packages and their letters. And that was when I learned, back in the 90s and 2000s, that people couldn't go live even where they used to live. They couldn't live with their kid's mother. They couldn't live with their own mother because they lived in subsidized housing, and they had a total exclusion policy of anybody with any kind of arrest or conviction. But the work that we've been doing nationwide has like whittled away at where it was. And something else to keep in mind too is it's not just people coming out of incarceration. It's people that got a probation sentence yesterday. And then when they literally are applying for an apartment, and someone says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you're saying like, oh, it could be assault, it could be a burglary, something that wasn't so serious that they wanted to put you in a cage for a while, but they did give you a sentence. So for that person, you're going to have a felony that is very, very recent. And that may scare away a lot of landlords because it's like, wow, it just happened, yesterday. And here you are looking for housing. And then for some of us, it may have happened 30 years ago, but they consider it to be so serious that they're going to keep on flagging it as a big deal. I too am a single father, and I'm actually looking for an apartment for either next month or the month after. And I have to put myself back into the mix. And then you have to keep paying all these application fees, $35, $50. And they don't even like clearly advertise about whether or not I might be a contender. And so if that thing was listed of like whether or not I might be considered, at least I'd save my $35 or $50. Now, if I give you my money based on the fact that, hey, I got a well-paying job, I've got a great kid, and we've got 2 cats, like, is that cool? Right? Like, for instance, even tell me up front whether or not my cats are allowed. I'm not going to apply if it's a no-go. I'm not going to give you my money, right? But they're not going to tell me about my criminal history. And so that applies to people, not just individuals like ourselves, right? But this applies to thousands and millions of people across the country. And so whoever thought it was going to be a good idea for public safety to force people to just kind of fend for themselves in some type of couch surf or, under the bridge kind of way, they were wrong, and the proof's in the pudding, and whoever had that idea in the beginning should just not be allowed to have any more ideas, probably. And so I think that's where we are now.
Yeah, and thank you for that too, Bruce. And we're talking about like building movements to advance the passage of legislation from state to state. There's some work that's required in order to do that. And John and Merf in particular, right? Each of you are in Seattle and Oakland, California, respectively. And so talk to us, you've been involved in pushing some legislation in different ways, right? In both Seattle and Oakland passed, far-reaching fair chance for housing laws. Can you talk to us a little bit about, what went into getting those laws passed, right? And we'll start with Merf, right? And obviously Merf, you're in Seattle, and what goes into that, right? Because I think on the one hand, right, we understand, we begin to start learning about the law and the language and what do we need to apply. But then there's the other thing, to organize people in a way to actually get legislation passed. So Merf, talk to us about that.
Yeah, it takes an incredible amount of time and resources. We didn't just all of a sudden write some legislation and it got passed. It was about 8-year effort to get ours passed. We started working on this in 2009 when we were hearing from folks that with everything that was happening online and with the internet and all the tenant screening agencies coming up, that people weren't able to find housing if they have a criminal record. Social workers weren't able to get folks they were working with housed. They couldn't even get into public housing. They couldn't get into subsidized housing, let alone private housing. And it was a huge issue. So we started talking to people about it. People started coming forward, and there were women who were living in transitional housing, and they met with our Human Rights Commission, and the Human Rights Commission said, okay, we'll work with all of you. We started building a coalition, and we had testimony, and 4 of the women talked. And then the next day in the Seattle Times was an article by one of the columnists, Danny Westneat, and he listed all the criminal histories of the women who had come forward. And so that put a chilling effect in some ways. And there was huge pushback. And the council member that was going to sponsor the housing and employment legislation said, oh no, I'm only going to do employment. I'm not going to touch housing. This is never going to happen. And so we had to take 3 steps back, decide how we were going to move forward. We worked for a couple of years on the employment, and that got passed. And in the meantime, we worked with public housing and subsidized housing providers. We worked with city council, excuse me, to get a resolution passed and created a separate process to talk about this issue with landlords, with developers, with anyone we could about why this was wrong, and continued to build the coalition. And then we went back, and at that time, city council was considering a 2-year look back period. And we were in the coalition talking about whether that would be a good idea. And people said, you're deciding in this room what level of oppression we should consider accepting. And we say none. And we were really moved by that and had to look at our own selves, that really we just wanted to get legislation passed, but that needed to not be what it was about. It really had to be about dismantling an unfair system and a racist system. And so we went back and said, no, that's not good enough. And the council was not happy. And so I went and talked with one of the more moderate conservative council members and shared my own experience. And she didn't know that about me, and it moved her. And so she wrote an op-ed, and and the mayor was opposed to it. But we also asked city council to hold their meetings at night on this issue so folks who were working could come and testify, and they did. And over 100 people came out and talked about their experience. There were veterans there who said they had criminal records and they couldn't get housing, but they had served their country for 5, 10, 15 years. There were school teachers who could teach school, but couldn't find housing for themselves and their kids. We had a doctor who had a drug possession charge and was a doctor and had, even though he had plenty of money, was having a hard time finding housing. So then we were able to pass it, but that was not the end, because then the Landlord Association filed suit, and that suit went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and then it went back to federal court, and we won at the district level, and then went up to the Ninth Circuit. And we won on one piece of it, and the other piece was not decided in the way that we would have liked it to be decided. But part of that ordinance still stands. And so from 2009 till to 2023, here we are, still fighting the fight. So that's the kind of effort and sustained effort that's needed to pass this kind of legislation, because there's incredible fear. And I will say that since the legislation passed in the last 10 years or so, there has not been a crime spree in rental housing. There just has not been.
Absolutely, Merf. And obviously, John, you're in Oakland, California, on the West Coast, and we know that California is one of the states that has an unhoused problem, right, where people are homeless, experiencing homelessness and being unhoused and living in encampments in Cali. And so the efforts over there, I know, requires just as much support and organization as well to do things. So talk to us about what's happening there, right? And what does it take, right? And what went into like getting some of the laws passed out there?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll start off by saying I'm glad Merf went first, because the blessing of the work that we were able to achieve in the cities of Berkeley and Oakland was predicated on learning from the experiences of folks like Merf in Seattle, as well as the people in Portland. They have fair chance housing ordinance that passed before us. But with that being said, it's very important to start with this concept. Transformation can only occur from close proximity. Now, what does that mean? It starts with having a team. I was very blessed and fortunate to work for organization Just Cities that was led by Margaretta Lynn. And it's interesting because I was someone who obviously formerly incarcerated, but despite that, right, I was someone who was blessed to receive a number of accolades and awards and all this public attention. And yet I still was not able to access housing. Right. So it starts with having a team. And it's important to note that when we talk about formerly incarcerated people, we have to understand that, number one, we're not a monolithic population by any means. All of us have different challenges, and there's intersectionality as well. But it's important to extend that concept and narrative to family members as well. And that's one of the things we identify, because for someone like me, there's some people who would just completely write me off as a convict. I would not have the ability to reach them, access them, let alone transform their thinking. But the conversation changes when it's a family member speaking about how they too are also impacted despite them not having a criminal record. Number two, it's important to connect with our elected officials and decision makers. And it was interesting because when we were working in the city of Oakland, we found out actually in a meeting that wasn't even related to fair chance housing, then council member, I was sharing with him what we're trying to do. And he mentioned that his son was currently incarcerated and was about to come home soon. And he said, so you mean to tell me when my son get out, he won't be able to access housing? I'm like, yeah, right? He said, dude, what is it we can do? So we have to always remember to humanize each other. Sometimes we get caught up in us versus them. I want to add one last thing that I think was truly, I know was truly a successful part of us getting the ordinance passed. Typically, anything related to housing-based issues and advocacies is rooted in the adversarial approach and relationship as it relates to landlords and property owners. One of the things we did in the city of Berkeley, we worked closely and directly with a member of their property management, right? Because we felt it was very important that for someone like me, until I'm blessed to own a home, I'm going to be a renter. So as a renter, I desire to have a positive and peaceful relationship with my landlord. Again, the concept of transformation from close proximity. As they began to hear our stories and understood, for example, someone like me, I have my criminal background report states I have a conviction from 1983. I was only 9 years old. I had to call my mom and say, Mom, I was that bad as a kid that I went to prison. Y'all get my point, right? But the point is, when that ordinance was passed in Berkeley, they said that was the first time that they were engaged on the front end as it relates to a housing related issue. So my point is, the key to success starts with engaging all the key stakeholders and not just our traditional allies and comrades.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that. And, you know, one of the things that you mentioned, I think is a salient point, is that, you know, transformation involves close proximity. And you mentioned how our education is important, right? To begin to change perception and ultimately get people to get involved in some way. And so I want to turn to you now, Bruce, and this is a little bit for you too as well, John. But Bruce, you know, consistent with what John has just raised around transformation and close proximity in education, you know, why is changing the narrative, or rather changing the way we speak about formerly incarcerated people and changing the dominant narrative necessary to this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think he really, you know, John was nailing it with the proximity, right? And, you know, as we all know, you know, coming out, you know, some of us got inspiration from the gay rights movement, you know, coming out and acknowledging kind of who we are, and that we're in every family, we're in every neighborhood, we're across, you know, racial and socioeconomic lines. And of course, there is a targeting, there is a disproportionate element, right? But when you start talking about it, you make it open for people to talk about it, whether it be in the church pews or in the halls of power. You know, you start hearing these other stories about my nephew, my cousin, my dad, and I've heard them from all sorts of people you never would have expected to hear it from. And it really ends up making them slow their roll a little bit when they say, like, you know what, I know somebody who's in that situation. And for those of us that have kind of put ourselves out there on a day-to-day basis, you know, it's important to be those ambassadors. And at times we got to pick our battles of like when we need to sort of use strong language in favor of what we're fighting for, because this is a civil rights battle of our time. And we also got to be understanding when we need to be, you know, ladylike, gentlemanly, or, you know, a little bit more polite, you know, to try to make sure people are hearing us, because communication, you know, is a two-way street. You know, and for people that know me, know that I committed a violent crime. You know, I actually killed someone as a teenager. It's amazing how few people actually want to know why or what happened. They really just stop the conversation right there. And so, you know, that is part of the conversation of like what happened, because what happened to me can happen to other people. And if you really care about crime prevention, you should understand how we kind of fall into crime, and, you know, the various situations that happens across, you know, particularly densely populated areas, particularly with areas of poverty, particularly areas where people of color live, where a lot of pollution is happening, and there's you know, mental illness and addiction that kind of comes through the water we're drinking. And, you know, these are things that then turn into crime. So we can't just show up at the back end and say punish them all. If we really want to prevent something, we got to see it at the front end. So the words we use matter. And sometimes we can use words that other people shouldn't use. You know, maybe I can be like, yo, my convict buddy, right? And that might be like a rapper using the N-word, right? But he might be saying it in a different kind of way than someone else might be saying the N-word, right? And so we also have to be mindful of you know, what level of privilege and what crowd am I in when I'm using certain language? Because in the end, we're talking about, you know, our communities, our families, our people. And I'll tell you what, my daughter never called me an ex-con. She never even called me a formerly incarcerated person. She calls me dad, you know, and to me, that's what I am. And so I think that we just need to keep that in mind when we're talking about groups of people and we're talking about individuals and families. We have other monikers than, you know, our conviction status.
Yeah, thank you for that too. I mean, it's really important, Bruce, what you raised. And, you know, what I'm hearing too from this is that we have to begin to like normalize the conversation and sort of engage people in a way that, you know, we begin to help them to understand our humanity, and conversely, we understand their humanity as well. One of the things you also mentioned, Bruce, or I think John may have mentioned, or Bruce earlier, like people have this secret, right? That they have a family or loved one that's also incarcerated, right? And when you think about New York City in particular, right? There's 750,000 people with conviction records in New York City, which is about 11% of the adult population, 80% of whom are Black or brown, right? So we're walking around people every day, and family members every day have a loved one or someone who's been impacted by the criminal legal system by virtue of either being detained or incarcerated. So having these conversations are important. I want to turn to you, John, too, as we move along through this conversation. I know we can talk about this all day long, But, again, why is if you can briefly talk to us, why is changing the dominant narrative necessary to this work?
Oh, it's essential and crucial for all the reasons that Bruce named, and I'll just add a few more. First of all, in order to dehumanize another person, we have already proven to dehumanize ourselves. What do I mean? Language like convict, thug, gang member, none of that engenders a sense of shared humanity. Those languages are used to justify oppressing another human being. But to go a step further, and I appreciate Bruce naming this as well, me as a father, again, if you feel like I, as someone who have a record, don't deserve housing, okay, you can have your opinion. What about my children? My youngest son just turned 9. Are you telling me my minor child does not deserve housing based on the actions of his parent? If you agree with that, then guess what? Let's talk about the systemic nature, the systemic root causes that lead to incarceration, right? I want to say another thing that's so important. 90% of convictions in America is a result of a plea bargain. People plead not because they're guilty. They plead because A, they can't afford bail. And anyone with a job knows incarcerated 2 days, no call, no show, you lose your job, you lose your ability to maintain your housing, right? Some people can't afford to get a private attorney. No disrespect to public defenders, but many of them are overworked. Let's bring race into it. 95% of prosecutors in this nation are white. What does that mean? It's about, again, there's cultural patterns that exist in our nation, right? And we understand the criminal injustice system has a racialized phenomenon to it. And then go a step further, and I want to say this on this last note. It's always interesting to me. Some people think that criminal records serve as a predictor to future behavior. If you analyze the mass shootings that take place in America, and let's be real, they're committed disproportionately by white males. Most of them don't even have a criminal record. So the argument I use is I am a known commodity. I'm a known entity. What does that mean? For anyone who got released from prison, first of all, you got to go through a vetting process, especially in California. They don't just release you. You got to go to the board. The board has to deem you suitable and ready for release. Number two, you're on supervised, you're on parole, right? So they're watching, they're monitoring everything you do. I don't have the same freedom as someone else who don't. Number three, I am on the radar of law enforcement, right? So I have to exemplify the highest standards of morality just to get off of that system. So my argument is you are better off having someone like me live next door to you as opposed to someone else who is not on that radar. Because again, no one was born with a record. Somebody have to have a first time to do something.
Yeah, thank you for that, John, too. And it's important, right? There's no genetic basis to people like getting involved in crime. It's typically crimes of poverty, and an environment influences people a certain way and inclines them to behave a certain way. The other thing that comes to mind is hearing what you, Bruce and John have mentioned, and Merf, I'm going to turn to you for our next question, is that, one of the things that people tend to accentuate on the landlord side is that, I'm afraid that they will live here, they're going to harm me or destroy my property. And then the community gets involved in this idea of people with conviction history, the records coming to live by them as a threat to public safety. And we know that that's not the case, right? In fact, to support in being co-producers of public safety, right? You want to have people with convictions history housed, involved in employment and all the other things just like anybody else, because then they become co-producers, right, of public safety in that way. And it then rules out this notion of people not being able to be assets to the community. So I wanted to add that. And I want to turn to you now, Merf, right? The landlord and real estate opposition to fair chance laws is significant. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, Merf, a little bit early on. But the opposition doesn't end, as we know, once the law is passed. And, again, talk to us a little bit about the Yim case, right, and the outcomes of the decision in the Ninth Circuit. And again, you touched on a little bit, but you can touch on a little bit more. And then we're going to move to Marie Claire, right, to kind of close us out before we get to our Q&A. So folk who are on, don't go anywhere because we have some really, really good stuff with Marie Claire closing this out.
The sociological studies show and demonstrate that there isn't necessarily a link to being a good tenant and having a criminal record. Like no one has absolutely proved that there's a link there. And I co-wrote an article with a PhD student about a criminal record is no crystal ball. And so she reviewed all the literature and no landlord has been able to point to a definitive study that shows that there's this kind of link. And yet we make this assumption over and over again that somehow a criminal record is reflective of your ability to be a tenant. And it's just not. And what was exciting for us about the Yim case in the Ninth Circuit is that it recognized the need for this type of ordinance. The Ninth Circuit recognized that homelessness is a huge, ginormous problem of people coming from jail or prison or juvenile facilities. The families that have kids who have been in juvenile detention and their record is not confidential face this issue. It also, in addition to homelessness, it recognized for the first time that race is a factor in these decisions, that there is racism in the system, and that those were reasonable and powerful governmental reasons for passing this type of ordinance. And so for us, that was really monumental, because when we started this work, Michelle Alexander's book, No New Jim Crow, had not come out yet. And people weren't able to make the link between the racism that says that someone with a criminal record is a bad tenant. Really, it was a proxy for race of not renting primarily to Black men or Native American men. But then that had a ripple effect of all people with criminal records. And so for the Ninth Circuit to say that again is a monumental change in our culture, to understand that the criminal justice system is not a fair and just system.
Yeah, thank you for that, Merf, too. And want to turn to you now, Marie-Claire. Like, we know, right, that racial discrimination in policing and prosecution results in Black people being 5 times more likely to be arrested than white people, and 5 to 6 more times likely to be incarcerated, right? And so Latinx people are also arrested and incarcerated at higher rates than white people. And so one of the reasons why we fight for fair chance housing laws is to stop the racial disparities in the criminal legal system from extending to housing, which we know when you connect race to housing discrimination, it has a disparate impact, right? Particularly on people of color in that way. And when we think about it, you know, landlords who are opposed to fair chance have started arguing that fair chance housing laws will increase racial discrimination in housing. You know, where does this argument come from? And is there any merit to it? Marie-Claire.
So I think, first of all, I want to kind of bring us back to Merf's comment at the beginning where, you know, there may have been criminal activity that took place, but there just isn't a record for it. And, you know, when we talk about the racial disparities in arrest and conviction, it's also important to remember that that's not necessarily reflective of higher rates of criminal activity. And I think that's been proven in a lot of different areas of the criminal legal system. But where this concern comes from, I think, is from a line of research that's been done, particularly in the employment sector, that has found that that's looked at ban the box laws and whether employers have access to criminal history records. And what some of those studies found is that when employers didn't have information about a person's criminal history, they tended to assume that Black applicants, especially Black men, did have a criminal record and therefore engaged in racial discrimination based on that assumption. And so some opponents have talked about this being a reason why ban the box laws don't work. So I think, first of all, there's been limited study of this in the housing sector. There's one study that came out earlier, but it is fairly limited in its findings. But also, I think from, you know, after we've had this discussion about race in this panel, I mean, that is essentially racial profiling and is really at the heart of what our fair housing laws prohibit. At the federal level with the Federal Fair Housing Act, and then the state and local levels. And really what it really speaks to is the pervasive nature of racism within our society, and especially within our housing systems. There are many points of racism within the criminal legal system, we also find that within the housing system. And the way to deal with this is not to back away from fair chance housing laws, but rather to put more resources into the enforcement of existing fair housing laws that we have. And, you know, and we have seen, you know, in the past year or so, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is a federal agency that overlooks housing, taking some positive steps in that direction. HUD oversees both the housing programs that it administers as well as the private rental market for fair housing, and they have lifted up some of the concerns around the use of criminal history records in housing. In June of last year, they sent out a memo to their investigators, really talking about the details of how these type of policies, criminal history records policies, can impact protected classes, including racial groups and people with disabilities, among others, and they are seeing that this is a really important this is really important anti-discrimination tool across the country. And I think, fair chance housing laws also operate within this environment where you need, it's not just going to be one law that's going to end race discrimination. You really need different laws that are attacking the different ways that landlords find to discriminate against people on the basis of race and other protected classes. It is, I think the other thing that this reminds me of is what the other panelists have talked about in terms of needing to change the narrative and needing to change the general culture. Part of what's been very good about these ordinances and these campaigns is because it has taken broad coalitions to come together and to really change the idea that a person with a record is inherently dangerous or inherently a bad tenant. And I think that is also one of the just really important positives and outcomes of these fair chance housing ordinance campaigns.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marie Claire. And as we promised, right, we would field a couple of questions from the audience, and we have a question. And one of those questions is, how effective have fair chance laws been in stopping actual discrimination by landlords, especially in hot rental market where landlords can find other excuses to deny housing, like lack of negative landlord reference, credit history, or income eligibility? And I'll feel whoever would like to take that. Don't all speak up at once. You can, but we won't be able to get it. But we'll start with Bruce. We'll go with Bruce, and then others would like to answer that, followed by John. And I don't know, Marie Claire and Merf, if you'd certainly like to answer, you're more than welcome. And then we'll move to give some orders, right, for folks to follow. And we'll wrap this up, but there's going to be some other discussion. So Bruce?
Yeah, we've had, various campaigns for the past 10 years, here in New Orleans and in Louisiana generally. We've gotten a few policy changes. Our housing authority created a really great policy in 2016 or 2015. I forget exactly when. But that was a multi-year approach and, really laid out who is even eligible to be screened. And then if you are screened, what's the process, right? And it was very transparent for people to be able to see where they would fit in this process for their own, knowing their own background, their own record. And we've managed to transform a lot of these housing gatekeepers. We got a statewide policy change around who would get the affordable housing tax credits that they hand out so much. And then you have to comply with certain conditions to be eligible to get those tax credits. But the biggest thing, though, is, kind of what Marie Claire was getting at, putting this stuff in the news, putting these conversations above board and getting people to show up, getting the media, and then finding people to start really, looking at the question of what is my role in public safety here? And, I think we've actually seen a big, we're far from done, right? But if you think about where we were 10 years ago, in the sense of people just not being able to get housing anywhere, and this myth of us being bad tenants, all my landlords or neighbors would say I'm the greatest neighbor ever, the greatest tenant ever. I'm DIY. I'm taking care of their pets, grabbing the mail, and I'm also actually a public safety servant because I make sure that my neighbors get home safe, and I actually know how to deal with confrontational situations. And I live in an urban area where there might be someone on the stoop who is not really aware of where they are even. and like, who's going to handle that situation carefully? Well, that's a situation that I'm actually a bit more comfortable in than most of my neighbors are. So I think that we actually really help public safety by being around, because we want a peaceful neighborhood, but we're also comfortable dealing with conflict situations. So I think, getting the word out there and forcing people on camera, let's say it's your mayor, your city council person, whatever, to basically say what that they will say when they really contemplate it and they're asked the question squarely, which is like, no, we need people, we need families in safe, stable scenarios. And then that impacts the minds of the landlords as well, because as we know, if you have someone being discriminated against, you have a discriminator. And so if I'm not trying to rent an apartment, I don't have a job, and I'm trying to rob you on the street corner, I'm the problem. But when I have a job and I'm trying to get an apartment and I'm filling out all the applications and you won't let me live there, you're the problem. And we need to point it out like that, because a lot of, I'd say, our bad landlords in New Orleans, no offense to California or anywhere else, but they live in California and everywhere else. And they're absentee landlords, and Airbnb has done more to destroy our housing market now than anything else. And so it's really limiting the opportunity for people to move into apartments, because they're just being, snatched up and turned into mini hotels, and with this kind of corporate safety first approach from a distance. And so that is a huge problem that we have to address as a community.
Got it. And thank you for that too. And I'm gonna turn to our last question, right? And I know that, and I also encourage people to look at the article that Allison has put in the chat. Our dear leader and colleague, Allison Wilkie from Many Voices Heard, has put a link in the chat. We strongly encourage you to read that article, Tenant Screening in an Era of Mass Incarceration, A Record is No Crystal Ball. But this is the last and final question we're going to ask for our panelists. And that is, for places that pass fair chance housing laws, what were the key strategies for raising awareness and having landlords change their practices? They said in Cook County, they've seen a big gap between the law and landlord practice in the first years of our new law. So if anyone wants to respond to that question, Marie, Merf, John, all of you even, if you can do it in 30 seconds apiece, that would be ideal. So whoever cares to start first, perfectly fine with me.
Okay, I'll jump in and be quick. We did a number of things. It starts with our local government, right? Our city attorney in Oakland also endorsed the ordinance, so information was passed out on a government level. Number two, we engaged in a robust engagement efforts, and that clearly included landlords, even our subsidized folks like Oakland Housing Authority, right? And number three, landlords in particular, we hosted a lot of forums with them. And I'll end on this note. It's interesting because we talk about landlords. Most of them didn't realize that they were unintentionally discriminating, because they wasn't even paying attention to their own application. They were just using some template off the internet. And the last thing, Zillow. We engaged Zillow, and Zillow intentionally included on any sites in Oakland and Berkeley the Fair Chance housing ordinance.
Yeah.
I'll just add really quickly that we lobbied for additional funding for the budget for a landlord liaison on this particular issue, and that was hugely helpful. Someone from that community working for the Seattle Office for Civil Rights on this issue.
And Marie Claire.
Well, I was in the Cook County campaign, so I'm a little bit needing other people to kind of weigh in here. But I think what we have seen is similar to what John mentioned, is like, how do we make this easier for landlords to comply? And we know, like in the public housing space, for example, there is a lot of use of templates and use of like boilerplate sort of language. And so at some point we had reached out to some of the folks who do the main templates and try to get them to change their boilerplate language, which then trickled down to the PHAs or the public housing authorities that were administering policies. So I'm not sure if Bruce might have more also to say about the various successes they've had in New Orleans and Louisiana, and how implementation has gone there.
Yeah, our landlord lobby is massive. The real estate people are huge, and they have a lot of control. But I think the space to go at really is, where there's strings attached for people to get a little subsidy, whether, landlords are choosing to enter the housing choice voucher program, for instance, and they're taking that government money so they can house somebody. They should be held to a standard. People that are getting affordable tax credits, whether they be big developers or small time folks, they have strings attached, and we can go after that and say, if you're going to get the money, you're going to get the subsidy, well, then you're going to comply with certain scenarios and issues. So I think that is one place to really start. And then also to build out a base of landlords. They could be mom and pop landlords or bigger developers that can really, weigh in and say, this is how we do it. And we're not having a problem with it. This is our application. This is our screening process. And, just like they got to try to figure out whether you got a job or not, right? Or how many people are going to be living here. I mean, they got to screen for various things. So, it doesn't need to be this sort of life or death, black and white, in or out kind of approach that, check the box that they've had. And really, like, if you can do something at a small level, even with one landlord that maybe has one facility, then you can use that as the beta model and showcase it and teach others that this is how we do it. But I do think, something that John mentioned about, having like a liaison, there's all sorts of departments in your city, in your county, in your state, where we can be saying, like, look, it's your job is to be working with landlords, whether it be code enforcement, whether it be subsidies, whether it be trying to find affordable housing. We're going to try to work with you so you can work better and more effectively with the base that you work with. And maybe, just maybe, someday we're going to have this great real estate lobby that says, like, wow, can you come in and show us how you do it? Or, like, we actually want to be on the right side of things, and not just be on the wrong side of things. So that's my take.
Well, thank you for that, John. And, I want to say that, there were some other questions that people were looking to ask. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we won't be able to get to them. However, we will send out some resources, right, and a follow-up email that can respond to some of those questions. And so, Bruce, John, Marie-Claire, Merf, thank you so very much for joining us today for this very important conversation. We will have you back at some point, right, just to inform us on some of the things that you are doing. And we appreciate your leadership, expertise, and partnership in this work. I want to acknowledge our leader here in the Fair Chance for Housing campaign in New York City, Allison Wilkie from Community Voices Heard, along with Zoe Johnson, who works closely with her, the rest of the steering committee members of the Fair Chance for Housing Act Coalition, as well as all of the coalition members who are deeply committed to ensuring that Fair Chance for Housing Act legislation is passed here in New York City. We want to all thank you, thank you, thank you. And we thank everyone who's joined us today for this really important conversation. Again, resources will be sent out in a follow-up email to everyone who has joined. But in the meantime, continue to fight. Continue to do the work necessary to empower people who have conviction records, especially as it relates to them being discriminated against because of their conviction records. My name is Andre Ward, and I certainly look forward to speaking with all of you sometime in the future. Thank you, everyone, and be well.
Adios.